and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and this is the Varietal Literature YouTube page. If you've never been here before, Varietal Literature is a group of writers from Vancouver who just like to have fun with narrative. And what we do on Tuesday nights here at 6:30 is we read traditional old folk tales live. There is a chat if you guys want to join in and be a part of, some of the discussion we have. You are about the tales being written or whatever really I guess you want to talk about. We do that as well here. If you've never been here before, well, welcome. And if you are not watching this live, which is a possibility, then you should know that down in the description below there is a timestamps that will take you to certain parts of the video. If you want to skip over, for example, the intro and get straight to the story, you can do that quite easily by clicking on the timestamps in the description below. Sorry, that took me a minute to think about. So the story we're reading tonight is again from a book that I have been enjoying called Nordic Tales. And it's a book of public access kind of stuff. And sorry, just a moment. There we are, just finishing something. And we are going to read it because it's a story I like. Anyways, Jack of Sjöholm and the Gan Finn is the story. It's a longer story, so it will actually consume our entire night. Just as we run about an hour, I think it'll come in a little under an hour, but it's going to run pretty much the whole time. Now, I actually teared up a bit at the end of this tale, and I'll see if you guys do as well. It is one of the more cohesive tales we have, but it's also a challenging first act. And by challenging, I mean it's told in a kind of old world way. So because of that, I'm going to add in some notes as we go along and even do a few little summaries. And again, I'm doing that because I think, I think you will require it, because I certainly, as a person who had to sit there and read it, and then there were lots of parts where I had to reread it. So with that in mind, we will sort of get our way through the first act together. GS is in chat, says good evening. I know a few bags of wind. Yeah, the bag of wind thing comes up in the first sentence, so I'm not really spoiling anything that way. Okay, so I'm gonna start this story, but then I'm gonna put a little frame around it first, which I don't normally do, but I feel is necessary for this story. And when we do that, sorry, I'm getting a pair of helping hands here. Can you pass me that? There's no way for me to get up once this is running. Yeah, I need the book this time because I need there's a bunch of footnotes on old language. Thank you. So the book we're reading, that the story originally I found it in, is this one, Nordic Tales. And I'm actually going to show you the picture at the head of this story because it will help us a lot. I'll give you a chance to absorb it. It's a fairly important part of the story and one that can be a little hard to visualize. So you can see there's a boat off in the corner there. And then a bunch of reindeer and a little hut with two people around a fire. Okay. So, this story is Jack of Sjöholm and the Gan Finn. And as we go along, I'm going to add a couple of little notes in the first third of it to help us track and understand what is a bit of an odd writing style at first. Let's start with the Gan Finn. Gan, according to the notes in this book, is the untranslatable word that is derivative from the Icelandic gandr, which means magic of a black or malefic sort. In other words, a somewhat malicious magic. I do encourage you not to think in terms of good and evil. just kind of what's on humanity's side and what isn't. And black magic isn't generally, but it can be. So, Gan Finn is a sort of black magic or a mage. Finn. There's no actual secret to that. Finn as in a person from Finland. The story itself is of a Norwegian origin, but it is about a Norwegian boatmaker and fisherman who goes to northern Finland. So, this title then is Jack of Sjöholm, which is a Norwegian place, and the Gan Finn, which is a sort of dark mage from Finland. Now, just to give you the frame up front, this is essentially a story about a boatmaker and a magician of sorts, if you want to think of it that way, who can sell bags of wind to people that need it to sail around rather stormy and challenging seas. That is established in the story, but not very clearly. So I feel like it's worth saying that up front. With that said, there's a nice little picture. And we will read the story, and we'll pause when we need to. In the days of our forefathers, when there was nothing but wretched boats up in Nordland, the folks must needs buy fair winds by the sackful from the Ganfin. It was not safe to tack about in the open sea in wintry weather. Now, if you think, I don't know what that sentence means, to put it another way, they had to buy sacks of wind from the dark mage in Finland. In those days, a fisherman never grew old. It was mostly womenfolk and children, and the lame and halt, who were buried ashore. Now there was once a boat's crew from Sjöholm in Helgeland, which had put to sea and worked its way right up to East Loften. But that winter the fish would not bite. They lay to and waited week after week till the month was out, and there was nothing for it but to turn home again with their fishing gear and empty boats. But Jack of Sjöholm, who was with them, only laughed aloud and said that if there were no fish there, fish would certainly be found higher northwards. Surely they hadn't rowed out all this distance only to eat up all their victuals, said he. He was quite a young chap, who had never been out fishing before. But there was some sense in what he said for all that, thought the head fisherman, and so they set their sails northwards. On the next fishing ground they fared no better than before, but they toiled away so long as their food held out. And now they all insisted on giving it up and turning back. If there's none here, there's sure to be some still higher up toward the north, opined Jack, and if they had gone so far, they might surely go a little further still, quoth he. So they tempted fortune from fishing ground to fishing ground till they adventured right up to Finnmark. But there a storm met them, and try as they might to find shelter under the headlands, they were obliged to at last put out into the open sea again. And it says in the notes here, Finnmark is the northernmost province of Norway, right within the Arctic Circle. There they fared worse than ever. They had a hard time of it. Again and again the prow of the boat went under the heavy rollers instead of over them, and later on in the day the boat foundered. There they all sat helplessly on the keel in the midst of the raging sea, and they all complained bitterly against that fellow Jack who had tempted them on and led them into destruction. What now would become of their wives and children? They would starve now, and they would have none to care for them. So they when it grew dark, their hands began to stiffen, and they were carried off by the sea one by one. And Jack heard and saw everything, down to the last shriek and the last clutch, and to the very end they never ceased reproaching him for bringing them into such misery and bewailing their sad lot. I must hold on tight now, said Jack to himself, for he was better even where he was than in the sea. And so he tightened his knees to the keel and held on fast till he had no feeling in either hand or foot. In the coal black gusty night he fancied he heard yells from one or other of the remaining boat's crews. They too have wives and children, thought he. I wonder whether they also have a Jack to lay the blame upon. Now while he thus lay there, drifted and drifted, and it seemed to him to be drawing towards dawn, he suddenly felt that the boat was in the grip of a strong shoreward current, and sure enough Jack got at last ashore, but whichever way he looked, he saw nothing but black sea and white snow. Now as he stood there, spearing and spying about him, he saw far away the smoke of a Fingam. So that means Finnish, so he realizes he's in Finland, and Gam is a type of unique hut that northern Finnish people were known to use, which stood beneath a cliff, and he managed to scramble right up to it. So we're up to the picture we started with. The Finn was so old that he could scarcely move. He was sitting in the midst of the warm ashes and mumbling into a big sack, and neither spoke nor answered. Large yellow humble bees were humming about all over the snow as if it were midsummer. And there was only a young lass there to keep the fire alight and give the old man his food. His grandsons and granddaughters were with the reindeer, far, far away on the feld. Here Jack got his clothes well dried, and the rest he so much wanted. The Finn girl, Simke, couldn't make too much of him. She fed him with reindeer milk and marrow bones, and he lay down to sleep on silver fox skins. Cozy and comfortable it was in the smoke there, but as he thus lay there, twixt sleep and wake, it seemed to him as if many odd things were going on about him. There stood the Finn in the doorway talking to his reindeer, though they were far away in the mountain. He barred the wolf's way and threatened the bear with spells. Then he opened his skin sack so that the storm howled and piped, and there was a swirl of ashes in the hut. So he opened his bag of wind and storm to scare away wolves and bears that would come and try and eat things like him. And when all grew quiet again, the air was thick with yellow humblebees, which settled inside his furs, whilst he gabbed and mumbled and wagged his skull-like head. But Jack had something else to think about besides marveling at the old Finn. No sooner did the heaviness of slumber quit his eyes than he strolled down to his boat. There it lay stuck fast on the beach and tilted right over like a trough, while the sea rubbed and rippled against its keel. He drew it far enough ashore to be beyond the reach of the sea wash. But the longer he walked around and examined it, the more it seemed to him as if folks built boats rather for the sake of letting the sea in than for the sake of keeping the sea out. The prow was a little better than a hog's snout for burrowing under the water, and the planking by the keel piece was as flat as the bottom of a chest. Everything, he thought, must be arranged very differently if boats were to be really seaworthy. The prow must be raised 1 or 2 planks higher at the very least, and made both sharp and supple, so as to bend before and cut through the waves at the same time, and then a fellow would have a chance of steering a boat smartly. So for those who have done any boating, what he's basically describing is making a boat that is sort of sleeker, longer, and sharper to better cut the waves. And if you've ever done kayaking, there's 2 types of kayaks. There's a river kayak and there's a sea kayak. And sea kayaks are made to cut waves. And basically what he's saying is their ship went down because the water went over the top and buried the ship. And so he wants to make one that cuts the wave rather than lets it flow over. And he sort of had this inspiration on the shore. And I'm explaining it because it matters a lot for the story, but it can slip past you if you don't really know much about boats. He thought of this day and night, the adjustments to the boats he would make. The only relaxation he had was a chat with the Finn girl of an evening. He couldn't help remarking that this same Kay had fallen in love with him. She strolled after him wherever he went, and her eyes always became so mournful when he went down towards the sea. She understood well enough that all his thoughts were bent upon going away. And the Finn sat and mumbled along among the ashes till his fur jacket regularly steamed and smoked. But Samke coaxed and wheedled Jack with her brown eyes and gave him honeyed word as fast as her tongue could wag, till she drew him right into the smoke where the old Finn couldn't hear him. The gan Finn turned his head right round. "My eyes are stupid. The smoke makes them run," said he. "What has Jack got hold of there?" "Say it is the white Patargman you caught in the snare," whispered she. And Jack felt that he was huddling up against him. She was huddling up against him and trembling all over. Then she told him so softly that he thought it was his own thoughts speaking to him, and the Finn was angry and muttering mischief and yorking, which is a type of sort of mumbled chanting, a singing, a chanting, a sort of ritual against the boat which Jack wanted to build. If Jack were to complete it, said she, the gan Finn would no longer have any sail for his fair winds in old Nordland. And then she warned him to look to himself and never get between the Finn and the gan flies. Those big bee things that were flying out of his clothes. Then Jack felt that his boat might be the undoing of him, but the worse things looked, the more he tried to make the best of them. In the grey dawn, before the Finn was up, he made his way towards the seashore. But there was something very odd about the snow hills. There were so many and so long that there were really no end to them, and he kept on trampling in deep and deeper snow and never got to the seashore at all. Never before had he seen the northern lights last so long into the day. They blazed and sparkled, and long tongues of fire licked and hissed after him. He was unable to find either the beach or the boat, nor had he the least idea in the world where he really was. At last he discovered that he'd gone quite astray inland instead of down to the sea. But now when he turned around, the sea fog came close up against him, so dense and grey that he could see neither hand nor foot before him. By the evening he was well nigh worn out with weariness, and was at his wits' end at what to do. Night fell, and the snowdrifts increased. As now he sat down on a stone and fell a-brooding and pondering how he should escape with his life, a pair of snowshoes came gliding so smoothly towards him out of the sea fog, and stood still just in front of his feet. "As you have found me, you may as well find the way back also," said he. So he put them on and let the snowshoes go their way, over the hillside and steep cliff. He let not his own eyes guide him, but his own feet carry him, and the swifter he went, the denser the snowflakes and the driving sea spray came up against him, and the blast nearly blew him off the snowshoes. Up hill and down dale he went all over the place where he had fared during the daytime, and it sometimes seemed as if he had nothing solid beneath him at all and was flying in the air. Suddenly the snowshoes stood stock still, and he was standing just outside the entrance of the Ganfin's hut. There stood Semke. She was looking for him. "I sent my snowshoes after thee," said she, "for I mark that the Finn had bewitched the land, so that thou shouldst not find the boat. For thy life is safe, for he has given thee shelter in his house, but it were not well for thee to see him this evening." Then she smuggled him in, so that the Finn did not perceive it in the thick smoke. She gave him meat and a place to rest upon. So just to catch you up, the gan Finn has become wise to the fact that he's making a better boat. That would mean, essentially, they would need less wind to move through the sea. Gan Finn sells the wind by the bag and doesn't want to sell it, so has used a magic to confuse him in the fields and tried to kill him, essentially. The gan Finn's caretaker, this girl Semke, is trying to keep the guy alive because she has fallen in love with him over the time that he's been there. But when he awoke in the night, he heard an odd sound, and there was a buzzing and a singing far away in the air. "The Finn the boat can never bind, the fly the boatman cannot find, but round in aimless whirls doth wind." The Finn was sitting among the ashes and yorking and muttering till the ground quite shook, while Semke lay with her forehead on the floor and her hands grasped tightly around the back of her neck, praying against him to the Finn god. Then Jack understood that the Ganfin was still seeking after him amidst the snowflakes and sea fog, and that his life was in danger from magic spells. So he dressed himself before it was light, went out, and came tramping in again, all covered in snow, and said he'd been after bears in the winter retreats. But never had he been in such a sea fog before. He'd groped about far and wide before he found his way back into the hut again, though he stood just outside it. The Finn sat there with his skin wrappings, as full of yellow flies as a beehive. He'd sent them out searching in every direction, but back they'd all come and were humming and buzzing about him. When he saw Jack in the doorway, and perceived that the flies had pointed truly, he grew somewhat milder, and laughed, till he regularly shook with his skin wrappings, and mumbled, "The bear will find fast beneath the scullery sink, and his eyes have turned all awry, so that he can't see his boat, and I'll stick a sleeping peg in front of him till springtime." Now, there's a lot of footnotes on that, so just give me a second here. So it says in the footnote for his eyes have turned all awry. The actual translation here is to delude, is from a Norse word referring to deluding sight by magic spells. So blinding him magically or creating hallucinations or delusions. And the second thing is that specifically he's trying to make it so that he can't see the boat Jack wants to build. But the same day the Finn stood in the doorway, he was busy making magic signs and strange strokes in the air. Then he sent forth 2 hideous ganflies, which flitted off on their errands and scorched black patches beneath them in the snow wherever they went. They were to bring pain and sickness to a cottage down in the swamps and spread abroad the Finn disease, which was to strike down a young bride at Bodo with consumption. But Jack thought of nothing else night and day, how he could get the better of the Ganfin. The last Semke wheedled him down and wept and begged him, as he valued his life, not to try to get down to his boat again. At last, however, she saw it was no use. He'd made up his mind to be off. Then she kissed his hand and wept bitterly. At least he must promise to wait till the Ganfin had gone right away to Jokkmokk in Sweden. Jokkmokk is a mountain between Sweden and Norway. On the day of his departure, the Finn went all around his hut with a torch and took stock. Far away as they were, there stood the mountain pastures with the reindeer and the dogs, and the Finn's people all drew near. The Finn took the tail of the beasts and bade his grandsons not let the reindeer stray too far while he was away, and could not guard them from wolves and bears. Then he took a sleeping potion and began to dance, and turned round and round till his breath quite failed him, and he sank moaning to the ground. His furs were all that remained behind of him. His spirit had gone all the way to Jokkmokk. There the magicians were all sitting together in the dark sea fog beneath the shelter of the high mountain, and whispering about all manner of secret and hidden things, and blowing spirits into the novices of the black art. So in other words, he went off to a meeting of wizards. But the Ganflies, humming and buzzing, went round and round the empty furs of the Ganfin like a yellow ring, and kept watch. In the night, Jack was awakened by something pulling and tugging at him as if from far away. There was, as it were, a current of air, and something threatened and called to him from the midst of the snowflakes outside. "Until thou canst swim like duck or the drake, the egg thou'st be hatching no progress shall make. The Finn shall ne'er let thee go southwards with sail, for he'll screw off the wind and imprison the gale." The egg there is the boat he's making. In other words, he will not be allowed to sail south, which is where his home is, that he's been stranded from, because the Finn doesn't want that boat to get out and ruin his business of selling wind. So he just won't give him any wind to do it. At the end of it, the Ganfin was standing there and bending right over him. The skin of his face hung down long and loose and full of wrinkles like an old reindeer skin, and there was a dizzying smoke in his eyes. Then Jack began to shiver and stiffen in all his limbs, and he knew that the Finn was bent upon bewitching him. Then he set his face rigidly against it, so that the magic spells could not get at him, and thus they struggled with one another until the Ganfin grew green in the face and was very near choking. After the sorcerers of Yokmok sent magic shots after Jack and clouded his wits, he felt so odd, and whenever he was busy with his boat and had to put something to rights in it, something else would immediately go wrong, till at last he felt as if his head were full of pins and needles. Then deep sorrow fell upon him. Try as he would, he couldn't put his boat together as he would have it, and it looked very much as if he would never be able to cross the sea again. But in the summertime, Jack and Semke sat together on the headland in the warm evenings, and the gnats buzzed and the fishes spouted close ashore in the stillness, and the eider duck swam about. The eider duck is just a type of bird. It's a cool-looking bird. You should look it up. If only someone would... Pardon me. If only someone would build me a boat as swift and nimble as a fish, and able to ride upon the billows like a seamew, sighed and lamented Jack. Then I could be off. Would you like me to guide you to Kyoto? Said a voice up from the seashore. There stood a fellow in a flat-turned-down skin cap, whose face they couldn't see. I should mention they call skin bags and skin hats, which I think is an unusual vernacular for us. They just mean animal hide, in case you haven't picked up on that. There's no, it's not like human skin. And right outside the boulders there, just where they'd seen the eider duck, lay a long and narrow boat with high prow and stern, and the tar boards were mirrored plainly in the clear water below. There was not so much a single knot in the wood. GS says, I used to have an eider down. That's true. That comes up in this. Eider down is the down feathers of the duck, and it is a major export. I would be thankful for any such guidance, said Jack. When Semke heard this, she began to cry and take on terribly. She fell upon his neck and wouldn't let go, and raved and shrieked. She promised him her snowshoes, which would carry him through everything, and said she would steal for him the bone stick from the Ganfin so that he might find all the old lucky dollars that were ever buried, and would teach him how to make salmon-catching knots in the fishing lines, and how to entice the reindeer from afar. He should become as rich as the Ganfin if only he wouldn't forsake her. But Jack had only eyes for the boat down there. Then she sprang up, tore down her black locks, and bound them round his feet, so they had to wrench them off before he could quite get quit of her. If I stay here and play with you and the young reindeer, many a poor fellow will have to cling with broken nails to the keel of a boat, said he. If you like to make it up, give me a kiss and a parting hug, and I shall go without them. Or shall I go without them? Then she threw herself into his arms like a young wild cat, and looked straight into his eyes through her tears, and shivered and laughed, was quite beside herself. But when she saw she could do nothing with him, she rushed away and waved her hands above her head in the direction of the Gam. Then Jack understood she was going to take counsel of the Ganfin, and that he had better take refuge in his boat before the way was closed to him. And in fact, the boat had come so close up to the boulders that he had only to step down upon the thwarts. The rudder glided into his hand, and aslant behind the mast sat someone at the prow, hoisted and stretched the sail, but his face Jack could not see. It kind of slipped past me when I was reading this the first time. A boat basically appeared, and someone on a beach offered it to him, and he took it. But we don't know who it is. So if you're wondering where did this boat come from, even Jack doesn't know. Away they went. And such a boat for running before the wind Jack had never seen before. The sea stood up around them like a deep snowdrift, although it was almost calm. But they hadn't gone very far before a nasty piping began in the air. The birds shrieked and made for land, and the sea rose like a black wall behind them. It was the Gan Finn who had opened his windsack and sent a storm after them. "One needs a full sail in the Finn cauldron here," said something from behind the mast. The fellow who had the boat in hand took such little heed of the weather that he did not so much as take in a single clue. Then the Gan Finn sent double knots after them. So this is a bit of a confusing one, but I will read the footnote for it. You make for it what you will. The Norwegian word for this is about magic knots. And it says, when the Finn tied one magic knot, he raised a gale, so 2 knots would give a tempest. So something about magic and knots, creating the storm, and he's worsening the storm. They sped along in a wild dance right over the firth, and the sea whirled up in white columns of foam reaching to the very clouds. Unless the boat could fly as quick and quicker than a bird, it was lost. Then a hideous laugh was heard to larboard. "Anfin Ganfin gives mouth, and blows us right south. There's a crack in the sack with 3 clues we must tack." And heeling right over the 3 clues in the sail, the heavy foremost fellow astride on the sheer strake, with his huge sea boots dangling in the sea foam, the way they scudded through the blinding spray right into the opening scene amidst the howling and roaring of the wind. Sailing stuff, if you're confused by that. They're using the sails to curve on a bad wind. The billowy walls were so vast and heavy that Jack couldn't even see the light of day across the yards, nor could he exactly make out whether they were going under or over the sea trough. But the boat shook the sea aside as lightly and as easily as if its prow were the slippery fin of a fish, and its planking was as smooth and fine a shell as a tern's eggs. But look as he would, Jack couldn't see where the planks ended. It was just as if there was only half a boat and no more, and at last it seemed to him as the whole front part came off in the sea foam, and they were scudding along under sail and half a boat. But when night fell, they went through the sea fire, which glowed like hot embers, and there was a prolonged and hideous howling up in the air to windward. If you've never been in a sea, the sea has many ways of making light, including the Northern Sea. Sea fire, bright light that would come up from the sea waters. And it has its own mythos behind it, which we're going to hear about. And the cries of distress and howls of mortal agony answered the wind from all the upturned boat keels they sped by, and many hideously pale-looking folks clutched hold of their thwarts. The gleam of the sea fire cast a blue glare on their face, and they sat and gaped and glared and yelled at the blast. So, those are Drog. Drog and Draugr are kind of zombies, kind of spirits. And it is a boat graveyard. And he's basically witnessing people that went down with the ship, gripping into the boat and howling and cursing out the wind that killed them. Suddenly he awoke, and something cried, "Now thou art home at Sjöholm, Jack." And when he had come to himself a bit, he recognized where he was. He was lying over against the boulders near the boathouse at home. The tide had come so far inland that a border of foam gleamed right up into the potato field, and he could scarcely keep his feet from the blast. He sat him down in the boathouse and began scratching and marking out the shape of the drog boat in the black darkness till sleep overtook him. Now, the drog boat was the boat that he was sailing in, so he doesn't really establish who was sailing it or anything, but the implication there is one of these sort of drowned people, these zombie people, had some magical black boat that he wants to recreate. When it was light in the morning, his sister came down to him with a meat basket. Just food. There's nothing more to it. She didn't greet him as if he were a stranger, but behaved as if it were the usual thing for him to come thus every morning. But when he began telling her all about his voyage to Finnmark and the Ganfinn and the drog boat he had come home in at night, he perceived that she only grinned and let him chatter, and all the day he talked about it to his sister and his brothers and his mother until he arrived at the conclusion that they thought him a little out of his wits. When he mentioned the drog boat, they smiled amongst themselves and evidently went out of their way to humor him. But they might believe what they liked, if only he could carry out what he wanted to do and be left to himself in the out-of-the-way old boathouse. One should go with the stream, thought Jack, and if they thought him crazy and out of his wits, he ought to behave so that they might beware of interfering with him and disturbing him in his work. So he took a bed of skins with him down to the boathouse, and he slept there at night. But in the daytime he perched himself on a pole on the roof and bellowed out that now he was sailing. Sometimes he rode astraddle on the roof ridge and dug his sheath knife deep into the rafters, so that people might think he fancied himself at sea, holding fast onto the keel of a boat. Whenever folks passed by, he stood in the doorway and turned up the whites of his eyes so hideously that everyone who saw him was quite scared. As for the people at home, it was as much as they dared to stick his meat basket into the boathouse for him. So they sent it to him by his youngest sister, merry little Malfrey, who would sit and talk with him and thought it such fun when he made toys and playthings for her, talked about the boat which should go like a bird and sail as no other boat had ever sailed. If anyone chanced to come upon him unexpectedly, he tried to peep and see what he was about in the boathouse there. He would creep up into the timber loft and bang and pitch the boards and planks about so that they didn't know exactly where to find him and were glad enough to be off. But one and all made haste to climb over the hill again when they heard him fling himself down at full length and send peal after peal of laughter after them. So that was how Jack got folks to leave him at peace. And let's just say we can all take a lesson from Jack. Behave like an absolute lunatic so people will leave you alone. It's a solid strategy. He worked best at night when the storm tore and tugged at the stones and birch bark of the turf roof, and the sea wrack came right up to the boathouse door. When it piped and whined through the fissured walls and the fine snowflakes flitted through the cracks, the model of the drog boat stood plainest before him. The winter days were short, and the wick of the train oil lamp, which hung over him as he worked, cast deep shadows, so that the darkness came soon and lasted a long way into morning, when he sought sleep in his bed of skins with a heap of shavings for his pillow. He spared no pains or troubles. If there was a board which would not run into the right groove with the others, though never so little, he would take out a whole row of them and plane them again, all round again and again. Now one night, just before Christmas, he had finished all but the uppermost planking and the gabs. He was working so hard to finish up that he took no count of time. The plane was sending the shavings flying their briskest when he came to a dead stop. Something black was moving along the plank. It was a large and hideous fly which was crawling about and feeling and poking all the planks in the boat. When it reached the lowest keel board, it whirred with its wings and buzzed. Then it rose, swept above it in the air, till all at once it swerved away into the darkness. Jack's heart sank within him. Such doubt and anguish came upon him. He knew well that no good errand had brought the ganfly buzzing over his boat like that. So he took up the train oil lamp and a wooden club and began to test the prow and light up the boarding and thump it well and go over the planks one by one. And in this way he went over every bit of the boat from stem to stern, both above and below. There was not a nail or rivet that he really believed in now. But now neither the shape nor the proportions of the boat pleased him any more. The prow was too big. The whole cut of the boat all the way down the gunwale had something of a twist and a bend and a swerve about it, so that it looked like the halves of two different boats put together, and the half in the front didn't fit with the half behind. As he was about to look into the matter still further, and he felt the cold sweat bursting out of the roots of his hair, the train oil lamp went out and left him in blank darkness. Then he could contain himself no longer. He lifted his club and burst open the boathouse door, and snatching up a big cowbell, he began to swing it about him and ring with it through the black night. "Art chiming for me, Jack?" something asked. There was a sound behind him like the surf sucking at the shore, and a cold blast blew into the boathouse. There, on the keel stick, sat one in a sloppy gray sea jacket and with a print cap drawn over its ears, so that its skull looked like a low tassel. Jack gave a great start. This was the very being he'd been thinking of in his wild rage. Then he took the large bailing can and flung it at the drog. But right through the drog it went, and rattled against the wall behind. And back again it came whizzing about Jack's ears. And if it had struck him, he would have never got up again. The old fellow, however, only blinked his eyes a little savagely. "Fie!" cried Jack, and spat at the uncanny thing, and back into his face again he got as good as he gave. "There you have your wet clout back again," cried a laughing voice. But the same instant Jack's eyes were opened, he saw a whole boat-building establishment on the seashore. And there, ready and rigged out on the bright water, lay an ottering, which is an 8-paddle boat. Let's make sure. Yeah, an 8-oared boat. That's what I'm trying to say. So long and shapely and shining that his eyes could not feast on it enough. The old un blinked with satisfaction, his eyes become more and more glowing. "If I could guide you back to Helgeland," said he, "I could put you in the way of gaining your bread too. But you must pay me a little tax for it. In every 7th boat you build, 'tis I who must put in the keel board." Jack felt as if he were choking. He felt that the boat was dragging him into the very jaws of an abomination. "Or do you fancy you'll worm the trick out of me for nothing?" said the gaping, grinning drog. Then there was a whirring sound, as if something heavy was hovering above the boathouse, and there was a laugh. "If you want the seaman's boat, you must take the dead man's boat along with it. If you knock 3 times tonight on the keel piece with the club, you shall have such help in building boats that the like of them will not be found in all Nordland." Twice did Jack raise his club that night. Twice he laid it aside. But the ottering lay and frisked and sported in the sea before his eyes, just as he'd seen it, all bright and new with fresh tar, and with the ropes and fishing gear just put in. He kicked and shook the fine, slim boat with his foot, just to see how light and high she could rise on the waves above the waterline. And once, twice, and thrice, the club smote against the keel piece. And so that was how the first boat was built at Sjöholm. Thick as birds together stood as a countless number of people on the headland in the autumn, watching Jack and his brothers putting out in the new ottering. It glided through the strong current so that the foam was like foss all around it. Now it was gone, now it ducked up again like a seamew, and past scurries and capes it whizzed like a dart. Out in the fishing grounds the folks rested upon their oars and gaped. Such a boat they'd never seen before. But if in the first year it was an ottering, the next year it was a broad, heavy fembering for winter fishing, which made the folks open their eyes. And every boat that Jack turned out was lighter to row and swifter to sail than the one before it. But the largest and finest of all of them was the last that stood on the stocks on the shore. This was the 7th boat. Jack walked to and fro and thought about it a good deal. But when he came down to see it in the morning, it seemed to him, oddly enough, to have grown in the night, and what is more, with such a wondrous beauty that he was struck dumb with astonishment. And there it lay ready at last, and folks were never tired of talking about it. Now, the bailiff who ruled over all Helgeland in those days was an unjust man who laid heavy taxes upon the people, taking double weight and tale of both of fish and of eiderdown, nor was he less grasping with the tithes and grain dues. Wherever his fellows came, they fleeced and flayed. No sooner then did the rumors of the new boats reach him than he sent his people out to see what truth was in it. For he himself used to go fishing in the fishing grounds with large crews. When thus his fellows came back and told him that they had seen what they'd seen, the bailiff was so taken with it that he drove straight away over to Sjöholm. And one fine day down he came swooping on Jack like a hawk. "Neither tithe nor tax hast thou paid for thy livelihood, so now thou shalt be fined as many half-marks of silver as thou hast made boats," said he. Ever louder and fiercer grew his rage. Jack would be put in chains and irons and be transported northwards to the fortress of Skar, to be kept close so that he should never see sun or moon more. But when the bailiff had rode round the Fimbering and feasted his eyes upon it and seen how smart and shapely it was, he agreed at last to let mercy go before justice, and was content to take the Fimbering in lieu of a fine. Then Jack took off his cap and said that if there was one man more than another to whom he would like to give the boat, it was his honor the bailiff. So off the magistrate sailed with it. Jack's mother and sisters and brothers cried bitterly at the loss of the beautiful Fimbering, but Jack stood on the roof of the boathouse and laughed, fit to split. And towards autumn the news spread that bailiff with his 8 men had gone down with the Fimbering in the West Fjord. But in those days there was quite a changing about of boats all over Nordland, and Jack was unable to build a 10th part of the boats required of him. Folks from near and far hung about the walls of his boathouse, and it was quite a favor on his part to take orders and agree to carry them out. A whole score of boats soon stood beneath the penthouse on the strand. He no longer troubled his head about every 7th boat, or cared to know which it was or what befell it. If a boat foundered now and then, so many the more got off and did well, and so that on the whole he made a very good thing indeed out of it. Besides, surely folks could pick and choose their own boats and take what they liked best. But Jack got so great and mighty that it was not advisable for anyone to thwart him or interfere where he ruled and reigned. Whole rows of silver dollars stood in the barrels in the loft, and his boat-building establishment stretched over all the islands of Sjöholm. One Sunday his brothers and merry little Malfrey, his younger sister, had gone to the church in the Fimbering. When evening came, they hadn't come home. The boatman came in and said that someone had better sail out and look after them, as a gale was blowing up. Jack was sitting with a plumb line in his hand, taking the measurements of a new boat, which was to be bigger and statelier than any of the others, so that it was not well to disturb him. "Do you fancy they're going out in a rotten old tub, then?" bellowed he, and the boatman was driven out as quickly as he'd come. But at night Jack lay awake and listened, and the wind whined outside and shook the walls, and there were cries from the sea far away. And just then there came a knocking at the door, and someone called him by name. "Go back whence you came," cried he, and nestled more snugly in his bed. Shortly after came the fumbling and tiny scratching of tiny fingers at the door. "Can't you leave me at peace o' nights?" he bawled, "or must I build me another bedroom?" But the knocking and the fumbling for the latch outside continued, and there was a sweeping sound at the door, as of someone who could not open it, and there was a stretching of hands towards the latch ever higher and higher. But Jack only lay there and laughed. "The Fimberings that are built at Sjöholm don't go down before the first blast that blows," mocked he. Then the latch chopped and hopped till the door flew wide open, and in the doorway stood pretty Malfrey and her mother and brothers. The sea fire shone about them, and they were dripping with water. Their faces were pale and blue, pinched at the corners of the mouth, as if they had just gone through their death agony. Malfrey had one stiff arm round her mother's neck. It was all torn and bleeding, just as when she gripped her for the last time. She railed and lamented and begged back her young life from him. So now he knew what had befallen them. Out into the dark night and the darker weather he went straight away to search for them with as many boats and folk as he could get together. They sailed and searched in every direction, and it was in vain. But towards the day the Fembering came drifting homewards, bottom upwards, with a large hole in the keelboard. Then he knew who had done the deed. But since the night when the whole of Jack's family went down, things were very different at Sjöholm. In the daytime, so long as the hammering and banging and the planing and the clinching rang about his ears, things went along swimmingly, and the frames of boat after boat rose thick as a sea fell on an eggovar, which is, another footnote, as a place where seabird eggs abound. But no sooner was it quiet of an evening that he had company. His mother bustled and banged around the house, and opened and shut drawers and cupboards, and the stairs creaked with the heavy tread of his brothers going up to their bedrooms. At night no sleep visited his eyes, and sure enough pretty Malfrey came to his door, and sighed and groaned. Then he would lie awake there and think, and reckon up how many boats with false keel birds he might have sent to sea, and the longer he reckoned the more drog boats he'd made of it. Then he would plump out of bed and creep through the dark night down to the boathouse. There he held a light beneath the boats and banged and tested all the keel boards with a club to see if he couldn't hit upon the seventh. But he neither heard nor felt a single board give way. One was just like another. They were all hard and supple, and the wood, when he scraped off the tar, was white and fresh. One night he was so tormented by the uneasiness of the new sexstring, which is a 6-oar boat, which lay down by the bridge, he ready to set off the next morning, that he had no peace till he went down and tested its keelboard with his club. But while he sat in the boat, he was bending over the thwart with a light. There was a gulping sound out at sea, and then came such a vile stench of rottenness. The same instant he had heard a waiting sound, as of many people coming ashore. Then up over the headland he saw a boat's crew coming along. They were all crooked-looking creatures, and they all leaned right forward and stretched out their arms before them. Whatever came in their way, both stone and stour, they went right through it. There was neither sound nor shriek. Behind them came another boat's crew, big and little, grown men, little children, rattling and creaking. And crew after crew came ashore and took the path leading to the headland. When the moon peeped forth, Jack could see right through into their skeletons. Their faces glared and their mouths gaped open with glistening teeth, as if they had been swallowing water. They came in heaps and shoals, one after the other. The place quite swarmed with them. Then Jack perceived that here were all they whom had tried to count and reckon up as he lay in bed, and a fit of fury came upon him. He rose in the boat and spanked his leather breeches behind and cried, "You would have been even more than you are already, Jack, if you hadn't built his boats." But now, like an icy whizzing past blast, they all came down upon him, staring at him with their hollow eyes. They gnashed their teeth, and each one of them sighed and groaned for his lost life. Then Jack, in his horror, put out from Sjöholm. But the sail slackened, that he glided into dead water. There in the midst of the still water was a floating mass of rotten, swollen planks. All of them had once been shaped and fashioned together, but were now burst and sprung, and slime and green mold and filth and nastiness hung about them. Dead hands grasped at the corners with their white knuckles and couldn't grip fast. They stretched themselves across the water and sank again. Then Jack let out all his clues, and sailed and tacked according as the wind blew. He glared back at the rubbish behind him to see if those things were after him. Down in the sea, all the dead hands were writhing and tried to strike him with gaffs astern. Then there came a gust of wind whining and howling, and the boat drove along betwixt white seething rollers. The weather darkened, thick snowflakes filled the air, and the rubbish around him grew greener. In the daytime, he took the cormorants far away in the grey mist for his landmarks. That's a type of bird. And at night they screeched about his ears, and the birds flitted and flitted continually, but Jack sat still and looked out upon the hideous cormorants. At last the sea fog lifted a little, and the air began to be alive with bright black buzzing flies. The sun burned, and far away inland the snowy plains blazed in its lights. He recognized very well the headland and shore he was now able to lay to. The smoke came from the gam up on the snow hill there. In the doorway sat the Gan Finn. He was lifting his pointed cap up and down, by means of a thread of sinew, which went right through him so that his skin creaked. And up there also, sure enough, was Samke. She looked old and angular as she bent over the reindeer skin that she was spreading out in the sunny weather. But she peeped beneath her arm as quick and as nimble as a cat with kittens, and the sun shone upon her and lit up her face and pitch-black hair. She leaped up so briskly and shaded her eyes with her hand and looked down at him. Her dog barked, and she quieted it so that the Ganfin should mark nothing. Then a strange longing came over him, and he put ashore. He stood beside her and she threw her arms over her head, and laughed and shook and nestled up close to him and cried and pleaded and didn't know what to do with herself, and ducked down upon his bosom, threw herself on his neck, kissed and fondled him and wouldn't let him go. But the Ganfin had noticed that there was something amiss, and sat all the time in his furs, and mumbled and muttered to the Ganflies so that Jack dare not get between him and the doorway. The Finn was angry. Since there had been such a changing about of boats over all Nordland, and there was no more sail for his fair winds, he was quite ruined, he complained. He was now so poor that he would very soon have to go and beg his bread. And of all his reindeer, he had only a single doe left, who went about there by the house. Then Samke crept behind Jack and whispered to him to bid for his doe. Then she put the reindeer skin around her and stood inside the gam door in the smoke, so that the Ganfin only saw the grey skin and fancied it was the reindeer they were bringing in. Then Jack laid his hand upon Samke's neck and began to bid. The pointed cap ducked and nodded, and the Finn spat in the warm air, but sell his reindeer he would not. Jack raised his price, but the Finn heaved up the ashes all about him and threatened and shrieked. The flies came as thick as snowflakes, and the Finn's furry wrappings were alive with them. Jack bid and bid till it reached a whole bushel load of silver, and the Finn was ready to jump out of his skins. But then he stuck his head under his furs again and mumbled and yoked till the amount rose to 7 bushels of silver. Then the Ganfin laughed till he nearly split. He thought the reindeer would cost the purchaser a pretty penny. But Jack lifted Samke up and sprang down with her to his boat and held the reindeer skin behind him against the Ganfin, and they put off from land and went to sea. Samke was so happy, smote her hands together and took her turn at the oars. The northern light shot out like a comb, all greeny red and fiery, and licked and played upon her face. She talked to it, fought it with her hands, and her eyes sparkled. She used both tongue and mouth and rapid gestures as she exchanged words with it. Then it grew dark, and she lay on his bosom so that he could feel her warm breath, and her black hair lay right over him, and she was as soft and warm to the touch as a ptarmigan when it was frightened and its blood throbs. Jack put the reindeer skin over Samke, and the boat rocked them to and fro on the heavy sea as if it were a cradle. They sailed on and on till nightfall. They sailed on and on till they saw neither headland, nor island, nor seabird in the outer Skerries moor. And that is the end of Jack of Sjöholm. We came up at exactly an hour, so that worked out really well. I hope you guys enjoyed that story. I know normally we read several short stories. It's always risky to read one really long one, because if somebody comes in late, they might just turn right around feeling that they've missed too much, which is true enough. I really like that story. It was, when I read it, it kind of took my breath away, because it just, you get kind of used to odd things happening in old tales. But it's rare that they really sort of connect and rhyme with each other, that there is a cycle to it. And one thing I should mention is the person who wrote this. It is a traditional tale, but the person who wrote it down is a man named Jonas Lee, spelled Lie, who is one of 4 quite profoundly impactful Scandinavian writers from the 19th century, I guess. I think he died in 1908. I think that definitely speaks to why it's so well rendered, because my other sort of favorite stories are the ones that Yeats wrote down about Ireland. But it's interesting because when you usually read folk tales and fairy tales, there's a moral, but it's, you know, it's heavily poster billboarded. Like, you know what it is. It's like, don't trust old people on the road or something. But this one had such a subtle and beautiful point. And it doesn't really slam your face with it. It's easy to miss. But in the end, he makes all this, he gets obsessed over making a better boat. And he trades human life for it. Something worthy of a curse, which he encounters. He's cursed for it. And all that money that he makes, you know, you'll notice that they describe it in much the same way as the money he makes. He trades for this girl he probably should have just stayed with and had a simple life. Holly's House said Penny thought that was creepy. Penny's my niece. It was creepy. It's an old ghost story. As it says in the beginning of this, I think now that we've read it, a good way to sort of go out is to go back to the beginning here. Is there a quick way to do that? Nope. That doesn't do it. Let's go up here. In the opening contents, it says something that I think is will be more profound here. But it is now in the lie, the guy who wrote this tells us some of his wild legends of his native province, Nordland, some of the grim tales on which he himself was brought up, so to speak, that he is perhaps most vivid and enthralling. The folklore of those lonely subarctic tracts is in keeping with the savagery of nature. We rarely, if ever, hear of friendly elves or companionable gnomes there. The supernatural beings that haunt those shores and seas are for the most part malignant and malefic. They seem to hate man. They love to mock his toils and sport with his despair. In his very first romance, I'm not going to try and pronounce it without looking it up, Lai relates 2 of these weird tales. Another tale in which many of the superstitious beliefs and wild imaginings of the Nordland fishermen are skillfully grouped together to form the background of a charming love story entitled Finn Blood, which we can read later. He goes on to talk about some other things. But I think that line, they seem to hate man, they love to mock his toils and sport with his despair, is in keeping with a certain amount of what we encountered tonight. So, I mean, I won't babble on. That is Fireside Fairytales. The story that we read was Jack of Sjöholm and the Gan Finn. If you want to read it yourself, it's from a book called The Weird Tales of the Northern Sea. Yes, of the Northern Seas, from Northern Seas, by Jonas Lie, which you can get on Project Gutenberg if you want, as a PDF or an EPUB file or whatever else for free. Yeah, and we do this every Tuesday at 6:30, so if you enjoyed that tale, come back next Tuesday. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It's how YouTube knows you enjoyed it. YouTube thinks you enjoyed it. they let other people give other people a chance to see it and see if they enjoy it. So if you liked it, fortunately, the big algorithm in the sky and it won't care unless you click a little thumb. The silliness of our modern era. For myself, though, that's all I have tonight. Thank you so much for GS and Holly's House being here. We'll be back next week with more tales. GS says, thank you, Rory. Loved it. Yes, it's worthy of Avalon's love of romance. That's a good thought. I never thought to ask her. Have a good night, folks. I will keep the fire warm. You sleep well.